Welcome back. I know I'm doing this in pieces just so you're not, feel like you have to sit here, for a long lecture. This one's one of the longer ones that I have. So let's continue looking at, now we're looking at Africa. We're looking at the other end. So we talked about Europe. They went to the Americas. They conquered it. Talked about the smallpox, started killing everybody. So they needed to get a workforce to do the labor. Remember that they're there to make money. So where do they go? They end up going to Africa and bringing and importing people from there to different parts of the Americas, but also Europe too. So one kind of major argument that people make, well, is this argument, and it's always problematic because if you ever go to like a white nationalist webpage or something, they say, African people enslaved their own people, and that's such a problematic statement to make because though it's true, slavery has always been a common practice. It's very different in regards to what happens in this particular situation. So yes, the Romans had slavery, Greeks had slavery, right? Egyptians and so forth. What happens here is it's quite unique, okay? So don't fall for those type of statements. So the Americas are colonized by the Europeans at this time. And the question is, who's going to do the work, right? Part of the problem was that a lot of Native Americans were dying, and it's noted about a third of them died due to smallpox and horrible working conditions, which is, it's a pretty high number, but, two-thirds still survive. But at that moment, people were dying, so you always needed to have that workforce because remember, the Europeans need to send things back to Europe. So the question then is why Africa? Well, there's a few reasons. Number one, Asia. Why not Asia? And we note, most historians have noted that Asia was just too far away, though there are arguments and there is literature out there that talks about Asian slavery. So though it did happen, again, Africa was maybe larger numbers. Why not the Americas? As I noted earlier, about a third of the population is disappearing, so that did not really make sense to keep on enslaving people, though they did. But people are dying, so African people replaced the labor that was dying off in the Americas. Why not Europe? Well, Europeans, again, they went through slavery too, but there were different reasons, and there's multiple. But one of them is, even the Pope sent a papal bull arguing not to enslave other Christians, whether they're Protestants or other forms of Christians. So slavery in Europe didn't quite happen in large numbers. So really you have Africa left. And what happens here is it's quite astronomical because, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning, it's directly linked to capitalism. So remember that I argued it's not capitalism that created it, but definitely facilitated it, because capitalism creates a system where there's a need for goods from the Americas to go to Europe, and somebody needs to produce that labor. And at this time, again, it was native peoples, but also African peoples that they were bringing over. Going back to that first question as to, well, people enslaved themselves. Well, again, in Africa, there is no concept as an African nation at this time. The concept of nationhood is a modern idea, maybe no more than 100 years old. So nationalism didn't exist. So African enslaving other Africans is not an argument to say, well, that's what makes it okay, because African people were, had conflicts among themselves. So they practiced a form of slavery that wasn't quite like the European. But again, they didn't see themselves as a collective, like maybe today us enslaving Californians or something, saying, well, we're all Americans. That is, they just didn't think that way because everybody had their own, different communal differences at this time in Africa. So that's important to know because, again, people who make that kind of comments of, well, they enslaved themselves, it's not that simple. And in Africa, like any other place in the world, there's a lot of internal fighting. So this is part of that process of warfare where people would enslave other people as they conquer them or at least take them in, right? So this is nothing unique to Africa, but again, the aftermath of what happens with the slave trade is. We'll skip this question. I kind of just want to go into the content. All right. So slavery, I don't give you too many numbers, but this is the one time that I do give you numbers to just give you, sorry, give you a sample of how many people were being transported. And those figures change because there's no official records, but it is estimated about 13 million people were taken from Africa and imported to different parts of the world, mostly the Americas. So numbers vary, everything from 11 million to about 15 million. So that's where we say 13 million being a good middle ground. But again, nevertheless, it's a lot of people who were being enslaved at this time. The major periods, as you can see, 1440, it's before the Americas are found, but Portuguese and Spanish people were going into Africa in the 1440s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and taking people and bringing them back to the mainland, to Europe. And it continues all the way up to the 1860s. The major periods were between 1650 and 1850, and between 1700 to 1809, in the early 1800s is when the United States stops the importation of slaves. About 2/3 of them came from West Africa. Just to give you a ratio in regards to gender, the majority were men, but in the later period we really begin to see more women, and I'll talk about that a little bit later when I talk about how women were impacted, women of color, and it's quite a horrific circumstances for them. Now understand that this slave system really begins to impact the African continent. The reading kind of highlights this a little, but one thing that we see is that Africa is kind of coming into its own. The communities there are developing, these kind of governmental systems there that are directly shaped by the slave trade. So it'll be interesting to see, had this slave trade not happened, what kind of government would they have established on their own without this situation coming up. But unfortunately, it came at the same time. So the slave trade became very important to the way states developed in a very kind of tyrannical way, because it was all about conquering other communities and getting that population and enslaving them, and then they would sell them off to Europeans for goods such as guns, and that kind of just snowballed into the type of government that they end up developing. So most of them very much so developed militaristic states at this time. We find that in Ghana, the biggest exportation was not like wood or some kind of resource, right, material resource, but it was another human being. That was the main thing that they exported from this region to other parts of the world, were other human bodies. So you can see the effect the long-term effect that it would have on these places. And add to that, by the 1800s, you have the colonization of Africa by European countries, and some of the problems that are there today are directly linked to the colonization of these regions. And then one kind of key point that I learned when I was in college is that African people had no concept of slavery, at least not the way we know slavery. They had a word that, it resembles slavery. The word was pika, and the word meant servant. But typically, this idea refers to the idea that you were a slave and you were a servant, and once you serve your time or paid out your debt, you'll be set free, and your kids were not considered slaves or anything like that. So that completely changes after the 1500s, as with our American history. All right, I'm going to stop it there. The next section will focus on how women were impacted, and I'm going to get a little bit theoretical here, addressing a few readings, but I think it's important to have this section onto its own, just because it impacts women of color, not just African women, but Native American women. I'll give you some examples. It impacts them in a very horrific way. Okay, as I noted earlier, 36% of the slaves tended to be women, particularly in the latter period, that is important to this narrative. So I'll stop it right there.